The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
There's an undercurrent of the Christian tradition that has always recognized that humility is an essential virtue for communities, and that humility is an especially important virtue for academic communities. So people who want to write and learn, they need to be humble, because humility opens the world for them.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Richard Gibson and Jim Beitler are English professors at Wheaton College. A couple of years ago, they wrote a book together called Charitably Writing, Cultivating Virtue Through Words. In it, they explore the ways that writing can be a spiritual discipline and a means of loving God and loving our neighbors. As soon as I heard that such a book existed, I knew I wanted to have Richard Gibson and Jim Beitler on the Habit Podcast. They did not disappoint, as you will hear in the following conversation. Jim Beitler and Richard Gibson, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast today.
Thank you.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So you all together wrote Charitable Writing, Cultivating Virtue Through Our Words. You're both professors at Wheaton in the English department, teach composition and rhetoric. And you remark that a sort of professional crisis led y'all to write this book. Can you tell me about that?
I'll speak first, because of the fact that I think in some ways the crisis is more acute for me.
This is Richard speaking.
Richard speaking.
Yeah.
My educational background was not within Christian higher education. So when I was hired at Wheaton 13 years ago, I was really entering a very strange and exciting new world. And I realized a few years in that particularly in my writing classes, I wasn't really doing anything differently than I had been doing when teaching at a large state university. And that wasn't entirely bad. I mean, there are certain disciplinary practices that pertain on any college campus, anywhere in the world. There's certain things about rhetoric that were true for the ancients as they are for us now. But I began to wonder what my classroom ought to look like in light of my commitments as a Christian. And that led me to go bother my friend Jim, who had been educated at a Christian college, in fact, the very one at which we work. And I began a conversation with Jim about what could be possible for us. You know, how could we reimagine the writing classroom? And then years later, we produced a book together during a sabbatical. Jim, how'd I do?
You did great. one of the things we were doing in our writing courses at Wheaton is we were trying to prepare students for writing that they would do in a variety of contexts beyond our courses, other classes, and then life beyond Wheaton College. But what we realized was we weren't doing part of what Wheaton's mission was, which was to think carefully about the intersection between that classroom, that content, and the life of faith, our faith. And so one of the resources, when I was at Wheaton, I had a Professor Alan Jacobs, who Richard had as a colleague, and he had written a book called A Theology of Reading, The Hermeneutics of Love.
Fantastic book.
Thinking about the ways in which we need to read in light of the double commandment to love God and our neighbor. And so as Richard and I were talking, we thought, well, what if we extend that work to the writing classroom?
Mm-hmm. Well, you, the three sort of big categories, or the three sections of the book are, humble listening, loving argument, and keeping time, hopefully. I'd love to talk about those three sections. And the way you talk about humble listening, I really love that. And I love the way you present and you speak of humility, not as only a negative virtue of squelching pride or similar sins, but rather an opening up and a freedom from really our own brains, a freedom to enjoy and be interested in things other than our own selves, which seems exceedingly important for a writer. So,
Tim, can I speak to you to talk about first?
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to back up and go back to the crisis just for a second.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I left out the best part, which is that we found a solution. And that ties into the organization of the book, because the book is organized around the key themes that emerged out of the conversation that Jim and I had. So Jim and I developed this idea to write a book called Charitable Writing, based on Alan's precedent. But then we had this kind of problem of, well, what does that book even need to contain? And what would be the basis of a book called Charitable Writing? I mean, what do we know? So our first plan, and we still actually have embarrassingly enough, have some of the documents where we laid this out, was to write.
One of which is a napkin.
Yeah, it is. It's a napkin, Starbucks napkin.
Attribute that to the Wade Center or something like that.
Oh yeah, they can clean something up with it. Coffee stain maybe. Anyway, so our original plan was to organize the book around doctrines. And I think what we were trying to do was a kind of theological underpinnings book that would help people to see that, key doctrines of the Christian faith, like the doctrine of creation, have something to tell us about our writing process. And I think Jim and I still believe that to be true. But as we were starting to work on the book, it wasn't quite taking the right shape. Things weren't going the right way, and we weren't utterly dissatisfied with it. But it didn't feel quite right, especially given that the audience that we were originally imagining for the book was going to be students at a Christian college. Now we've discovered, even the fact we're having this conversation is a testimony to what we discovered, which is that other people care, which is exciting for us. But our breakthrough came one day when I was pondering humility. And I just was thinking about humility, and I was thinking about the problem of how do you visualize humility? What does humility look like in practice? And how can I explain it to someone else? And then using a certain search engine that we all know and love, provided for us by our good friends at Google, I just started looking for classic Christian depictions of humility in the visual arts. And I stumbled upon a picture by this 15th century Italian painter named Benedetto da Bindo. What a name. And Benedetto has this picture in which Mary is depicted humbly, seated on the ground, holding our Lord. And then opposite, in a second panel, so it's called a diptych, a 2-panel picture, there's Jerome translating the New Testament. And this picture was a huge breakthrough for me and Jim, because it allowed us to say, hey, wait, maybe our book could be about the virtues. And maybe in some sense, charitable writing is our attempt to bring together lots of different kinds of materials to help other people to imagine how the virtues that we know and love and are, frequently giving lip service to could actually be a part of our writing practice. And Jim, what do you want to say about the humble listening section itself?
Well, I just want to follow up on what you said, and in that when we made that step, we realized we didn't have to reinvent the wheel in any sense. The Christian tradition is rich with all sorts of resources, both for thinking about practice, but also for thinking about models for imitation. And those two things go together. And so the artwork, which we have several pieces in the book, we think help our readers, and helped us for sure, with those two things, practice and imitation of the virtues in the writing life.
Yeah. In terms of humility specifically, we definitely our big insight, which we gathered through C.S. Lewis kind of officially in the writing, and then the unspoken voice who should have gotten more credit is the poet Dante. Because as we were thinking about humility, we realized, like, okay, there's a lot that we can say about humility and the way in which humility allows us to combat pride. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing for writers. But as we were trying to imagine our students enacting humility, we started kind of looking at other resources, and we realized actually there's an undercurrent, and I think it's long running, but there's an undercurrent of the Christian tradition that has always recognized that humility is an essential virtue for communities, and that humility is an especially important virtue for academic communities. So people who want to write and learn, they need to be humble, because humility opens the world for them. And I know it's
I think that's the big insight from that chapter is, we all know that humility is important and necessary for community and for creativity, but I think we still tend to think of it as negative. Right? Yeah. It's important for community because it squelches the pride that hurts community. Yeah. And I love this idea of how do we talk about? I mean, really, the idea of finding new metaphors to talk about lots of things is pretty central to your book, and we'll get to new metaphors for talking about argument in a minute. But I think we really need some better ways of talking about humility as a way of opening us up, and not just a way of shutting down something. And I hope that y'all did that in this book.
One of my uncles, who's a Buddhist, read the book generously, and the humble listening section was his favorite section. And what really resonated for him was the way that we're making an argument for what other traditions will refer to as something like a beginner's mind, right? A kind of willingness to say, hey, I don't know everything. And maybe shedding some of my learning or shedding some of my authority allows me to go back to the beginning and reconsider the problem I'm facing, the object I'm describing, the issue that I'm trying to address, and that there's a kind of strength in embracing our Lord's model of humility. And that in some sense, being Christ-like in a humble way allows us to become better, more insightful writers, because we can get past our own presumptions that we already know what's going on. We never do.
Yeah, and then there's a practice that's associated with that, and that is listening. And so in the book, we talk a great deal about listening, and of course, then what the question becomes: what do we need to listen to? And it's in part the arguments of others. Listen very carefully to those, but then it's also thinking about how we listen to not just arguments, but in a kind of metaphorical sense, listening to the conventions of discourse, the kinds of texts that we're constructing. What are their key features, and how might we attend to those carefully? So we really talk about listening in several different ways in the book as well, and it's that practice that allows us to enact the virtue of humility.
Yeah, I know on at least one occasion in your book you quote from the book "They Say I Say," which is a book I've used in the classroom before, and I think it's such a beneficial book in so many ways. And one thing I really appreciate about that book, and I know it doesn't originate here, but it's just where I'm used to. It's where I got accustomed to it. Was the idea that we're inviting students to participate in a conversation that they didn't start.
That's right.
And that A, they didn't start the conversation, but B, they have something to contribute to that conversation.
Yeah.
So that book starts with a very famous metaphor from Kenneth Burke about an unending conversation. You may remember it. So the Kenneth Burke invites us to imagine that you enter a parlor and there's a conversation going on that's been going on long before you got there. And so you go into the parlor, you listen for a while. There's that word listening until you catch the tenor of the argument. Those are Burke's words. And then you put in your oar. Burke says that you kind of make your own argument. But then the conversation is going on so long that you need to leave. And so you leave with the conversation still vigorously in process. And so many writing instructors use that metaphor to help students think about the academic life and the writing life. What our book does is it's got a kind of secret structure. So if you think about three of the parts of that metaphor, you come in and you listen, then you put in your oar, and then you leave because the conversation keeps going. It's interminable, Burke says. We were thinking about the virtues that go along with those things.
Yes.
So what's the virtue that goes along with listening? It's humility. What's the virtue that goes along with putting in your oar? It's charity. And what's the virtue that goes along with leaving the conversation and hoping it continues? It's hope, essentially. So
it's great. I love it. Again, to continue the idea of humility, when we resist the contributions of others in our work, and y'all talk about this, we more or less by definition limit ourselves to our own brilliance. And I don't care how brilliant you are, you're just not quite brilliant enough.
No.
The two of you may be. Maybe I shouldn't speak for you.
Definitely not.
No. No, and I mean, certainly Jim and I think Jim and I, especially given that we're English professors, I mean, what attracted us to academia is that we wanted to spend our lives listening to other people. You know, I really like reading, but my favorite thing to do is to read. And that's the best part of the job for me is reading with other people, particularly getting a chance to read rich literature that, like Jim's discussion of the Burke analogy, like it just keeps giving us something. Mm-hmm. So, right now I'm preparing to teach a course in the fall on Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. And every page of Anna Karenina, it gives me something. And I would be happy to just have as my job reading Anna Karenina. I've gotten pretty close. But I think that's the reward of humility is when we stop perceiving ourselves as having to be the answer man or the answer woman and have the answer to everything. Suddenly we realize there's enormous traditions, tremendous works that have been composed by others that are still relevant to us and that can still resonate with us and help us to explain the world to ourselves, and then in turn help us to explain the world as we understand it to others.
Yeah.
I think humility is really life-giving.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. And as you give up on the idea that you're supposed to be the answer man or the answer woman, you greatly improve your chances that you might help somebody find some better answers.
That's true.
Well, speaking of helping other people find and to together with other people finding answers, finding truth, I'd love to move on to section 2, charitable argument or loving argument. And as you say, love and argument are kind of an odd couple. we aren't accustomed to thinking of love and argumentation as working together in the same yoke. So,
yeah, Jim, solve that problem.
Yeah, could you solve that for us, Jim?
It's a tricky one for sure. I mean, this is one of the things about the book. This book is an invitation to think about the ways in which the virtues go together with the writing process. And there are lots of answers to that question. How can we bring the kind of Christian understanding of charity together with the discipline and practice of writing? So we don't claim that we have all of the answers about this. One of the things that we do in the book is we invite readers to consider the metaphors that we're using when we talk about argumentation. So argumentation tends to get talked about in terms of war metaphors. This is something other scholars have talked about extensively. And so we were thinking, what are some fresh metaphors that actually come to us from the Christian tradition that we might employ in thinking about argumentation more fruitfully?
I was really struck when Jim and I spoke with some federal judges last summer about some of the themes of charitable writing, and one of the judges talked about the way in which she understands her court as a place in which she needs to give dignity to the participants. And I was really struck by that as a kind of second order consideration for those of us who actually oversee arguments. I think the arguing is loving insofar as making a rational argument to someone else shows that you think that person is a rational fellow human being. And I also think that argumentation is inherent in language itself. So to me, if we go back to the failed first attempt at charitable writing, and I think argument is part of the doctrine of creation. I think it's really remarkable that God left us a space as rational, willing beings to make arguments to one another. Where should we eat for lunch? The answer to that question is an argument. Where should we build the bridge? What's the best law? Should we go to war? I mean, all of those situations are places where we get to express ourselves as humans and lovingly invite other people into the process of decision making. But I also am really struck by the idea that when we conduct arguments, we're also almost in all cases going to remain attached to the people that we make arguments to or have arguments with. So love needs to be a part of it, because otherwise the community just falls apart. If there's no love, then argument leads to a kind of breakdown. And I was just thinking, while you both were talking, about the way in which I think our book is also really trying to make a very strong case for hopeful argumentation, where we make a contribution to a larger conversation and thereby hope that conversation is going to keep going. Right? That there's certain conversations that Jim and I are very invested in, and that we're going to spend our lives writing and teaching about, with the hope that people will continue having that conversation well into the future. And if it's not for our sponsorship, some of those questions might go away. I think this is. I'll reveal our ages. I mean, Jim and I are now in our 40s. I hope it's okay that Jim said I revealed that. But I've now reached the point where I've realized how contingent so much of my world is. That if people don't speak up for certain kinds of knowledge or certain kinds of debates, like those or even books, if books I love, they can go away. Everything needs a sponsor, it will cease to be.
Yeah, I love that language of sponsorship.
Yeah.
And to return to your idea, Richard, that we typically in argumentation remain in relationship with the people that we are, or remain connected with the people we argue with. It's one of the great dangers of the internet, is this sort of hit and run argument, that I'm not connected to the people that I'm arguing with.
So true.
And then, I'm also troubled by the fact that model then enters into, the Tocqueville took so much hope in the sort of local, the local arguments, so to speak. And, the idea that if we are making decisions in a community, we're making decisions with people that we're going to be living with.
That's right.
later. Therefore, we're hopefully civil. And
Tocqueville wandering around New England, looking at those local assemblies is music to my ears. I love that section.
Yeah, that's great stuff.
Yeah.
But I see videos of school council meetings these days.
Oh, yeah.
That it's kind of like these people don't act like these are people that they're going to be living with.
So I'll speak quickly about this, and then Jim is far more wise than me about these sorts of matters. So then, Jim, you're going to get to take it away. But I unfortunately, I don't think that there's an easy, quick fix. I'd love to say read charitable writing and buy one or 12 for your friends, and everything will be all right. But I do think that part of the argument that we're making, which is a hopeful one, is that we really, and we're not the only people making this argument. There's other much more influential, much wiser Christian voices making the same argument, but that now needs to be a time where we are reconsidering Christian education, we're reconsidering Christian formation, and we might not be able to get all of the members of our own team on board with this, but for those of us who care, and those of us who we're called to Christian education, we need to look very hard at ourselves and the way that we're training students to prevent our people from being the instigators in those situations. As I've aged, I've become more and more convinced that we're always shadowing and imitating one another. The left and the right are always doubles of each other in some way. And so if you enter that school board meeting with the flamethrower, almost necessarily the other side's going to find or build their own flamethrower by the end of the conversation. So I'm hopeful that the coming generation of Christian scholars and statesmen, Christian voters and citizens, Christian pastors and lay people will realize that they need to reconsider how they have been formed and how their children are going to be formed, so that our people look a bit more like Jesus in the school board meeting.
Yeah. On what grounds are you hopeful, Richard?
Well, I think the thing is it's been striking to me to see how many books like ours have come into existence in such a short period of time. I'm also hopeful because of the fact that these virtues have survived for thousands of years. Yeah. And again, like thinking about the contingency of things, much has passed away. Whole civilizations have passed away, and yet here we are talking about humility, talking about agape love, talking about Christ-like hope. And then finally, this is a very small sample size, but the student response to the book has been incredible. Now, the students in my class and Jim's class, like, they kind of have to like the book, but I mean, the response, at least on our campus, has been really enthusiastic. And it's not because of the fact that Jim and I are so smart. It's because the students are realizing, oh, wait a second. Yeah. The Christian tradition is offering me such incredible resources to live well and, right, to circle back to the problem of the internet, to live in a different way than the toxic society that I see around me. To me, it's so much of social media has just become such a corrupt place. And I think the students are realizing that. A lot of my students have withdrawn multiple, if not all of their social media accounts in the last 2 years. Uh-huh. They don't want to see the dirty grudge matches that are happening daily. All right, Jim.
Jim, Richard has teed you up as the real expert here. Yeah. So,
oh my goodness. Well, that's clearly not true.
Fix the world, man.
So I think Richard said something that I want to pick up on. It has to do with education and what it looks like. I had a kind of breakthrough a couple semesters ago as I was kind of working through this book and thinking, how can I teach the second section of the book, or really pivot from the first section to the second section? There's a fellow by the name of Carl Rogers who practiced a form of listening and argumentation that I really like, and the notion is this: whenever you're arguing with somebody, you need to listen to what they say and then summarize their argument to their satisfaction before you go on with making your own argument. Mm-hmm. And so that requires you to do two things. It requires you to practice humble listening, but then it also requires you to make an argument in a charitable way. So it's a kind of pivot from the first section of the book to the second. a couple semesters ago, I invited my students, instead of doing a single paper, kind of a single authored paper, I invited them in groups of 3 to construct a Rogerian argument together. So they were required to pick an issue about which they disagreed and then construct a dialogue on the page. And the goal of that dialogue was not to win. It wasn't to like convince your opponents that you were right, but the goal of the dialogue was essentially to construct a Rogerian argument and construct a good one. And so what students were then doing was they were working together about issues they disagreed to construct a meaningful dialogue.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of assignment I think after we kind of did this in class, that's the kind of assignment that I think will lead to citizens who are able to go to that school board meeting and not bring a flamethrower, to be able to say, I hear what you're saying. This is what you're saying. And this is how I can compromise or negotiate.
Jim, could you clarify what is the end product of a Rogerian dialogue?
So in my case, it looked like a kind of like a script. So that you'd have one student's name, their statement, and then you'd have the next student's name and their statement. So it looked like a script essentially, and many of them were 12 to 20 pages in length essentially. So.
And but is the end product a fuller understanding of some corner of truth? I mean, what?
The end product is an argument over an issue about which there's disagreement, essentially, and it doesn't need to resolve in a way that, like, I agree with you essentially on this point. Finally, by the end,
I'll just add here that I've been really struck by my students' responses to the loving argument section of the book, especially in light of our principle that knowing other people's arguments allows you to make your own argument better. And we're working with 18 and 19-year-olds in at least some of the classes we teach. Jim also teaches the book in an advanced level with juniors and seniors, but like that's an important new thought to them. That we actually want to know what principles and what evidence other people are pulling in. So listening carefully and lovingly to other people's arguments does multiple kinds of work for us. So on the one hand, it shows that we're respecting other people's dignity, we're respecting other people's powers of rationality, we're building and maintaining relationships, but we're also in some sense gaining new resources that help us to make our own case better. I mean, that's just the way we think within the academy. But I realized while teaching my class, like the students needed the framework of like, wait a second. By doing loving argument, I'm not saying that everybody is always right. I'm not conceding that a position that I disagree with for principled and evidence-driven reasons is right. But I do need to understand that position in order to respond, and understanding that alternative position actually might help me to reconsider and enrich my own.
And as a Dostoevsky scholar, I mean, you see this in action in the Brothers K, right?
Oh my gosh. Dostoevsky is so good at taking in every argument. And then, of course, Dostoevsky's incredible power within the worlds that he builds is to show us where those other ideas lead. And circle back to this question about hope. I think that Christians need to learn again about hope and remembering that this is a long project that God has undertaken in which we play such a minuscule role. So trying to keep our arguments out there in the public, keeping them viable, and not allowing our arguments to get entangled with a certain picture of Christians as a kind of, I don't know, militaristic subset or something like that. Like I want to keep our ideas out there, and I want us to remain a kind of Christ-like people who can continue to make those arguments because they're so good, and the alternatives don't lead to places that people actually want to go. I'll just leave you with that. Just read your Dostoevsky and you'll grasp like some of the key ideas of modernity. They don't lead where people think they're headed.
Yeah.
That's a conversation for another time.
That's right. Okay, so one thing we have we addressed the idea that that we typically think of war metaphors and battle metaphors when we think of argument. What are some alternative metaphors that might be more productive than battle metaphors?
Well, a lot of people have talked about this. So, again, we're not the first to do this. There's metaphors of barn raising, putting up a barn together, essentially allowing your idea to become the property of the group, not our idea. Bread making, making soup. And then the metaphor that we talk about in the book is the feast. Essentially argumentation as feasting. Richard, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I also just want to say we're very much committed to this is an ongoing question.
Yeah.
We've done this in our classrooms where we've given students enormous pieces of paper and sent them off and said, let's just think about what a good conversation is like, and then they just generate similes for 15 minutes. And it's often really rich, and it's helpful for them in reconsidering what we're doing in our classroom. So the feast is just one metaphor that to us kind of has naturally percolated up out of the tradition, because it allows us to think about pertinent virtues like hospitality. I mean, hospitality practices obviously are all over the place in the scriptures. They have a very strong presence in the imagined community that's coming out of the Jesus movement, right, in the New Testament. So hospitality should be our thing. People should know us for our hospitality. And, following Alan Jacobs' kind of breakthrough in his book on reading, we're realizing like, hey, there's all of this good ethical teaching in the Christian tradition, but our rhetorical traditions haven't really been drawing on it, or at least they haven't been doing so lately.
Yeah.
So let's bring hospitality in. Let's think of ourselves as hospitable writers and readers who are entertaining other people's ideas, who are projecting our ideas with the idea that they would be welcome somewhere else. Now, does that mean that every book can be received with the same hospitality? Absolutely not, right? There are some books that you just might have to close 15 pages in, but that we should begin the exercise as agape people seeking to be hospitable. And the same should go with our arguments and with the context in which we create arguments. And I've just found in my classroom situations, giving students multiple metaphors allows them to be nimble in thinking about what kind of argument should they make in this context or this context. And for those of you who are listening out there who are teachers, this is a good exercise right now because students are very concerned about sharing positions that they might feel judged about by their peers. And so I noticed a couple of years ago, and this is even before kind of the hoopla of the recent past, that some students would kind of retreat from the conversation because they were so worried that someone else in the class was going to attack their view. So I think about this in particular about a young woman in one of my classes who admitted following one such conversation that for years she had resisted speaking in class because she was so worried that a classmate would attack her view. That was her language. And so creating a context in which students understand that their responsibility to one another is to try to understand the other person's argument from the inside before any kind of debate about the merits of one argument or another can begin. It's really changed some of the dynamics in my classes where students feel much more comfortable sharing. And this is my last thing I want to say, and then maybe Jim, you want to add something here. I've also told students that they are not responsible for defending a position that they share. So if Jim shares a view in class and he feels like he's articulated it well, and then someone raises an objection later in the conversation, Jim is not then responsible for having to go back and defend the view. It's just a view on the table. If someone else wants to articulate a reason why that view is strong or worthy, great. If not, then we just move on. And that also has been helpful to students because the military metaphor almost obligates you, right? If someone attacks, for you to defend. Right. And then that becomes an attack on the other person. And then suddenly the class becomes a squabble between two people whose feelings are both hurt. And neither of whom have probably learned very much that day.
It becomes personal, essentially. The idea is my idea in that context, rather than our idea that we're gonna work with.
Jim, were you about to add something to that?
No, I think that was great.
I think whatever metaphor we arrive at, I think it's really helpful to think in terms of together we are building something, whether that's a feast or a dance or or whatever. And it takes
an American republic. I don't know,
a republic, for instance, something like that.
Yep.
And we need each other. We need these different views. So the ways that Joseph Pieper talks about Aquinas in his little the silence of St. Thomas, or whatever that book is. He talks about this idea of that Aquinas was so committed to knowing what was true that he was super willing to engage people who disagreed with him in hopes that he would learn something he didn't already know.
That's such a good model. Also, Pieper's great. He also is interested in the virtues. Very good on hope.
Oh yeah, so good. Okay, speaking of hope, let's talk about the idea of keeping time hopefully. And you all didn't offer this as a transition between sections, but it feels like a transition when you quote Augustine when he says, "I endeavor to be one of those who write because they've made some progress." So good. And who by means of writing make further progress. Isn't that great?
Yeah. So, I mean, I hope people listening to this like Augustine, but one of my colleagues pointed out to me like a year after the book came out that it's just thoroughly Augustinian. And I took that as a compliment. I think he meant it as a compliment. But Augustine had his lamentable moments where he was the attacker, but he also was much more bound up by classical rhetorical principles than I think we are. And so it's even more astonishing that Augustine was able to have moments like that. And you also quote him earlier on, where Augustine says that humility needs to be one of the central virtues of oratory. But Augustine was so rich in offering us a picture of writing for the purpose of discovery, which really changes the relationship between the writer and the reader. Because if you admit at the outset, I am writing to find out what I think, right? You're inviting the reader to join you on that journey toward understanding. Rather than saying, I know what the ultimate answer is, and now I'm presenting to you a kind of reasoned apology for it, which Augustine can also do. I think that, I think most of us, most of the time, are in the first Augustine mode. I think we're trying to figure out what we think, which is why we're talking or writing.
But I also think, even with as we teach students to write from a thesis statement.
Oh yeah.
That's assuming that you know what your thesis statement is when you start.
Yeah.
And if you're not open to the possibility that your thesis statement is all that you haven't had your best idea yet, you're so limited. And you've read enough student papers to know it's so often, you sort of slog through, and then on page 4 or 5, they say something brilliant. And then they say, in conclusion, because they didn't get to the good idea until page 4.
Well, what you're talking about, and Jim's going to speak well on this in a moment, I'm sure, but what you're talking about is rethinking, and this is an educator's problem, but it's also a general writer's problem, rethinking the architecture of our writing time. Even people who are professional writers, I know some of my colleagues who are full professors, they're seasoned academics, operate on this assumption that you can just sit down and write something, right? That your magical fingers will just, release these words in a couple of hours and you'll have your piece. And we all know by experience that that's not true. And so our book is really counseling people to embrace that, to recognize that we need to build different architectures of writing and to fill those architectures, not just with spaces for drafting and editing and peer review, but also prayer, meditation on the examples of others who've been really valuable to us. I mean, our book, suggests that we should fill our studies and our imaginations with the images of saints, right? Or stories of saintly lives. For people who are listening to that saying, it sounds a little bit old school. Like, every tradition has its model lives. So I know at one point in college, I was going to a kind of missional church, and the missionaries' lives were central. And I would say to students who are coming from traditions like that, you want to write in such a way that you channel the example of those lives into your writing. You also want to make space in your writing process to remember what those lives were about. For Jim and I, we feel like a lot of the work that we do with our writing classrooms is just setting up structures so that students don't submit their first thought as their last thought.
Yeah.
And so much of that is just slowing down. It's what we talk about in part 3, which is keeping the time of writing in a different kind of way. So as Richard was talking, he was mentioning things like peer review, workshopping, spaces for drafting, and what you were saying, allowing for there to be time when we get to what a lot of people call a discovery draft, which is when your thesis appears at the end. If you have time, you can turn that paper on its head, and then produce a much better second draft. But you have to allow for the keeping the time of writing. And then just to elaborate on what Richard was saying, when you do that, what we discovered, and this is still something that I'm trying to put into practice well, it is a challenge, is that the writing process affords multiple occasions for prayer. At every stage, one can offer prayers that are relevant to what are going on at that stage. So the blank page becomes an occasion to offer a prayer about entering into the process of co-creating.
Yeah. I mean,
go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I would just say this is another thing that's kind of implicit in the book, but it's important to make it explicit, especially in a context like this one. Jim and I are really committed to a picture of writing that's inherently collaborative. It doesn't matter what it is. And we actually think that that's a truer description of what happens when we write. So we resist the capital R romantic picture of the kind of solitary genius, in his or her study, just kind of suddenly effusively producing this brilliant manuscript. That's just not how writing works, and that's not how it should work. And the truth of the matter is that because writing's so hard, you always need other people's help. So just let them in. Let God into the process. Let your peers into the process. I don't write anything that a peer or a research assistant reads before I submit it. And I've even oriented my career towards certain writing opportunities where I know the editors and I trust that the editors are going to really carefully review, sometimes in uncomfortable ways, the work that I send them. Because I understand that the writing process is inherently collaborative. The best work that I can write is work that is written with other people's help.
And part of our task as teachers is to help bring students into that process, to realize that this is what professional writers do. Professional writers share their work with other people before publication.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely. All right, we're running out of time here. Can I ask you one more question? The question I traditionally ask at the end of these conversations, and that is, who are the writers who make you want to write? Jim Beitler, can we start with you?
Absolutely. I'm actually going to give a shout out to the one of the people we included in this book, and that is Stephanie Paulsell.
Yes.
So she wrote a piece
so good.
that is called "Writing as a Spiritual Discipline." she teaches at, I think it's Harvard Divinity School.
Yeah, that's right.
And so she wrote this essay, Writing as a Spiritual Discipline, and she graciously allowed us to include that essay as an appendix in our book. And so many of our ideas were motivated, enriched by her work. And so I think in terms of charitable writing, she was one person that I think we were both inspired by.
Great.
Yeah, so good. I have three.
Okay.
One is my boy Dante.
Okay.
I just love Dante so much, and Dante is an intellectual universe that I hope people will come to Wheaton College to enjoy with me.
So you read Dante, you think, yeah, I think I want to try that.
Yeah, I teach Dante every semester, and honestly, Dante is kind of daunting if you're reading the wrong translation on your own. But I find endless resources in the Dantean universe. Even when I think Dante is terribly wrong about things, he's wrong in ways that are provocative for me. And I feel the same way about Count Tolstoy. I during the pandemic phase, I have read War and Peace 4 times.
Really?
And I find sentences on almost every page that are really illuminating to me. And then lastly, I already said this, but I want to reiterate my thorough debt to St. Augustine, who I think has made it possible for me to be a Christian academic. And again, Augustine is hard. It's hard to pick up City of God, but Confessions is a very approachable, beautiful work written by a teacher of rhetoric. But I think, Jim, it's the same for you. Like when we read Augustine, we're just always thinking to ourselves, oh my gosh, like, should I write an article about this? Or should I use this as an epigraph?
The other Augustine book that's very, very short, but is worth your time is On Christian Doctrine or on Christian Teaching. It's just a fantastic book. So
so true.
And that's and that was one of the books that inspired this project, because it inspired Alan. So
wonderful. Well, Jim Beitler, Richard Gibson, thank you so much for being on the Habit Podcast today. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
It's been a joy to be here.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. To check out more of our podcasts, visit rabbitroom.com/podcast. Our work at The Rabbit Room would be impossible without the generous support of our membership. If you'd like to learn more about membership at The Rabbit Room, visit rabbitroom.com/member. And thanks for listening.
The Habit Membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.